Winston Churchill once dismissed John Foster Dulles as a dull man. That was perhaps Churchill's greatest mistake, because hidden behind those thick glasses and that cold, stony expression was a political mind that was chillingly sharp. Dulles did not merely conduct diplomacy, he sought to bend the world to his will. From installing pro-American dictatorships to pushing humanity to the very edge of the nuclear abyss just to test the nerve of his enemies. He was a reckless poker player gambling with millions of lives. He offered history a brutal lesson, how easily a single signature in a cold room can set the entire world on fire. John Foster Dulles did not rise from nothing. He was a legacy hire in the truest sense. Both his grandfather and his uncle had served as U.S. Secretary of State. As a child, instead of fairy tales, he sat at the dinner table listening to debates about borders and treaties. Governance was in his blood, but the uncomfortable truth lies in his past on Wall Street. Before he stood up to preach morality to the world, Dulles was a lawyer protecting the wallets of corporate giants. And his biggest clients in the 1930s? The industrial cartels of Nazi Germany. At that time, Dulles did not view Hitler as a monster. He viewed him as a stable business partner. His law office in Berlin even flew the swastika flag. The man who made a fortune, aiding the rise of fascism, later became the supreme moral judge of the free world. That is history's cruelest irony. As the war clouds gathered in the late 1930s, a profound shift occurred within the man. The lawyer began to give way to the theologian. The failure of the League of Nations, the collapse of the global economy, and the rise of fascism shook Dulles to his core. He began to realize that international law and financial contracts were not enough to hold the world together. There was a spiritual void at the heart of modern civilization, and he believed this void was being filled by the godless religions of fascism and communism. In 1937, he attended the Oxford Conference on Church, Community, and State. This was his road to Damascus. Surrounded by theologians and religious thinkers, Dulles found a new language for his global ambition. He stopped talking about bond yields and started talking about moral law. He became convinced that the only way to prevent constant war was to establish a world order based on Christian principles. He began to write and speak prolifically, not as a corporate attorney, but as a lay prophet. He published War, Peace, and Change in 1939, a dense philosophical treatise where he argued that the status quo was rigid and brittle, and that the world needed a mechanism to allow for peaceful change, or else it would explode. Yet even as Hitler's tanks rolled into Poland in September 1939, Dulles remained an isolationist at heart. He was deeply wary of dragging the United States into another European slaughter. He remembered the trenches of 1917. He remembered the broken promises of 1919. He served as the chief foreign policy advisor to Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican presidential candidate, and pushed for a platform that kept America out of the conflict for as long as possible. He believed that the United States should be the arsenal of democracy, perhaps, but not necessarily its infantry. There is a famous, somewhat chilling anecdote from this period where Dulles, ever the legalist, argued that the German invasion of Poland was not technically a violation of international law in the way the Allies claimed. It was a moment that revealed the icy detachment that still governed his mind, a mind that could dissect the legalities of an invasion while the bombs were falling on Warsaw. It took the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor to finally shatter his isolationism. When the Japanese bombs fell in 1941, the debate was over. Dulles, too old to fight, threw himself into the intellectual war effort. He became the chairman of the Commission on a Just and Durable Peace, a body formed by the Federal Council of Churches. While the generals were planning the invasion of Normandy, Dulles was planning the peace that would follow. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes of Versailles. He authored the 6 Pillars of Peace, a manifesto that called for a global organization stronger than the League of Nations, one that could enforce international law and protect human rights. This work brought him into the orbit of the Roosevelt administration. Despite his staunch republicanism, he became a key player in the formation of the United Nations. At the San Francisco Conference in 1945, Dulles was there, his pen moving across the draft documents, helping to write the preamble to the UN Charter. It was a moment of redemption for the young man who had watched silently at Versailles. Now he was one of the architects. He fought to ensure that the UN would have teeth, that it would be a forum where the moral force of the world could be brought to bear against aggression. But even as the ink was drying on the UN Charter, a new and darker reality was emerging. The alliance with the Soviet Union, born of necessity to defeat Hitler, was crumbling. Dulles was one of the first to smell the smoke. While many in Washington were still toasting Uncle Joe Stalin, Dulles looked at the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and saw the same tyranny he had watched rise in Germany, but this time it was painted red. His religious worldview, newly sharpened, began to frame the conflict in absolute terms. This wasn't just a geopolitical dispute over borders, it was a spiritual war. On one side stood the Christian West with its respect for the individual and the rule of law. On the other stood godless communism, a collective anthill that crushed the human soul. By 1946 and 1947, acting as a delegate to the UN General Assembly, Dulles began to voice a harder line. He watched as the Iron Curtain descended. He saw the cynical maneuvers of the Soviet diplomats, the way they used the UN as a propaganda platform rather than a hall of peace. The internationalist Dulles, the man who wanted to unite the world, was slowly dying. In his place, the Cold Warrior was being born. He began to criticize the Truman administration's policy of containment. He argued that merely holding the line against the Soviets was a defeatist strategy. It was immoral to leave half of Europe enslaved. He began to whisper a new word, a dangerous word, liberation. During the late 1940s, Dulles was a man in waiting. He ran for the Senate in New York in 1949 and lost, a bruising campaign where his lack of retail political skills was painfully exposed. He was not a baby kisser, he was a lecturer, but he remained the Republican Party's foremost expert on foreign policy. He wrote the book War or Peace in 1950, a scathing critique of the Democrats' handling of the Cold War. He accused them of being soft, of allowing China to fall to the communists, of failing to understand the nature of the enemy. Then, the Korean War broke out in 1950. The Cold War had turned hot. The North Korean army surged across the 38th parallel, and suddenly, Dulles's warnings looked prophetic. The Truman administration, desperate for bipartisan support and recognizing Dulles's intellect, brought him back into the fold to handle a specific crucial task, the peace treaty with Japan. This was a masterclass in diplomacy. Dulles spent a year crisscrossing the Pacific. He had to convince the survivors of Japanese atrocities, the Australians, the Filipinos, the New Zealanders, to sign a lenient peace treaty with their former tormentor. He had to convince them that a strong, rearmed Japan was necessary to balance the power of the Soviet Union and China in Asia. He used every trick he had learned at Sullivan and Cromwell. He cajoled, he threatened, he smoothed over grievances with the promise of American security guarantees. The resulting Treaty of San Francisco in 1951 was his personal triumph. It ended the occupation of Japan and locked the island nation firmly into the American orbit. It also created the ANZUS Pact, securing the loyalty of Australia and New Zealand. For the first time, the world saw what John Foster Dulles could do when given the reins. He had built a fortress in the Pacific. He had turned a sworn enemy into an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. He returned to Washington not just as a lawyer, but as a statesman of the First Order. He was ready for the main stage. And in 1952, the main stage arrived in the form of a grinning war hero named Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the soldier who hated war. Dulles was the civilian who seemed ready to wage it. It was an odd couple pairing that would define the decade. When Eisenhower won the presidency, there was never any doubt who would sit in the office at Foggy Bottom. On January 21, 1953, John Foster Dulles was sworn in as Secretary of State. He was 64 years old. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. He took the oath with his hand on a Bible, his eyes magnified by his glasses, staring past the cameras, staring past the crowd, staring towards the east. The gray man had finally stepped into the light, and he brought with him a vision of the world that was as stark, as rigid, and as terrifying as the Old Testament God he worshipped. The era of containment was over. The era of confrontation had begun. He didn't want to manage the Department of State. He wanted to weaponize it. The department he inherited was a crime scene of morale. For years, it had been the favorite punching bag of Senator Joseph McCarthy and the rabid anti-communist wing of the Republican Party. They claimed the State Department was infested with reds, pinks, and fellow travelers. They claimed that American diplomacy had been sabotaged from within by traitors who had lost China to the communists. The diplomats, the career men who had spent decades studying foreign languages and cultures, were terrified. They waited for Dulles to defend them. They waited for the man of intellect, the man of the law, the man who had written the preamble to the UN Charter to stand up and say, "Enough, these are patriots, not traitors." They waited in vain. In one of the most shameful chapters of his career, John Foster Dulles did not stand as a shield for his people. He handed them over to the executioners. He believed that to fight the Soviet Union effectively, the American instrument had to be pure. There could be no doubt, no hesitation, and no diversity of thought. He immediately demanded positive loyalty, a chilling phrase that meant it wasn't enough to simply not be a communist. You had to actively demonstrate your fervor for the anti-communist crusade. He hired a man named Scott McLeod as his security chief. McLeod was a McCarthy disciple, a former FBI agent with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Dulles gave him free rein to tear the department apart. The purge began. It was a bureaucratic bloodletting. The most tragic victims were the China hands, men like John Peyton Davies and John Carter Vincent. These were brilliant experts who had served in China during the 1940s. They had written reports predicting that Mao Zedong's communists would win the Civil War against the corrupt nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. They hadn't advocated for Mao. They had simply told the truth about what was happening on the ground. But in Dulles's Washington, being the bearer of bad news was treason. Because they predicted the Red victory, they were accused of desiring it. Dulles forced them out. He stripped the State Department of its eyes and ears in Asia just as the continent was about to explode into war. He valued ideological purity over intelligence. It was a mistake that would blind the United States and Vietnam a decade later. But in 1953, Dulles saw it as necessary hygiene. With the dissenters purged and the department cowed into silence, Dulles set about changing the very atmosphere of American diplomacy. The change was physical. He ordered the removal of alcohol from the diplomatic reception rooms. The clinking of martini glasses, the lubricant of old-world diplomacy, was replaced by the silence of the library. He began to work on Sundays, a signal to his subordinates that the crusade against communism did not take days off. He was a workaholic of a lethal variety. He didn't trust the bureaucracy. He didn't trust the chain of command. He wanted to hold the entire world in his own head. He would often bypass his ambassadors, picking up the telephone to call foreign leaders directly, ignoring the carefully crafted cables and protocols. He carried the foreign policy of the United States in his briefcase and in his hat. To his subordinates, he was a distant, terrifying figure who would stare at the ceiling during meetings, whistling softly through his teeth while you tried to explain a crisis in the Middle East. You never knew if he was listening, or if he was praying, or if he was plotting your dismissal. But the most profound shift was not administrative, it was philosophical. Under Dean Acheson and Harry Truman, the Cold War had been viewed as a geopolitical struggle, a contest between two great powers for land, resources, and influence. It was dangerous, yes, but it was rational. Dulles changed the lighting. He reframed the Cold War as a theological war. It was no longer about the 38th parallel or the status of Berlin. It was about good versus evil. It was God versus the devil. This was not a rhetorical flourish for Dulles. It was a deep Calvinist conviction. He believed that communism was godless terrorism. He believed that because the Soviets were atheists, they were unbound by any moral law. They could lie, cheat, and murder without a flicker of conscience because they answered to no higher power. Therefore, you could not truly negotiate with them. You could not find common ground. You could only confront them, contain them, and eventually defeat them. He introduced a new vocabulary to Washington. Neutrality, the idea that a nation like India or Egypt could stand apart from the conflict, was, in Dulles's words, an immoral and short-sighted conception. In the binary world of John Foster Dulles, you were either a soldier of the cross or a servant of the Kremlin. There was no Middle Earth. This moral absolutism terrified America's allies. The British and the French, old empires accustomed to the gray areas of power, looked at Dulles and saw a fanatic. They saw a man who might start World War III because of a Bible verse. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, detested him. He found Dulles preachy, duplicitous, and unbearably self-righteous. But they had to deal with him, because behind the preacher stood the immense, booming economy of the United States and the largest nuclear arsenal in human history. As the winter of 1953 turned into spring, Dulles began to craft the strategy that would define his legacy. He knew that the American public was tired. The Korean War had dragged on for 3 bloody years. It was a meat grinder war, a stalemate that consumed thousands of American lives for hills that had no names. President Eisenhower, the man who had commanded the greatest armada in history on D-Day, had run on a platform of ending the war. But how? How do you end a war with an enemy you consider to be the devil without surrendering? Eisenhower and Dulles sat in the Oval Office and looked at the ledger. The United States was spending 13% of its GDP on defense. It was unsustainable. Eisenhower, a fiscal conservative, warned that if they spent too much on guns, they would destroy the very way of life they were trying to defend. We must not, Eisenhower said, bankrupt ourselves to be safe. Dulles had the answer. It was a terrifying answer, but it was an answer. If you can't afford a massive army to fight the Soviets everywhere, you don't fight them everywhere. You change the rules of the game. You stop matching them tank for tank and soldier for soldier. Instead, you rely on the one thing you have that they don't have enough of, the atom. The New Look policy was being born. It was an economic decision wrapped in the language of Armageddon. Dulles was about to propose that the United States should turn its nuclear arsenal from a weapon of last resort into a weapon of first choice. He was about to tell the world that the price of crossing an American line was not a skirmish, but an incineration. The gray man was preparing to pick up the dice, and he was ready to bet the house. On the evening of January 12, 1954, John Foster Dulles stood before the members of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. The room was filled with the elite of the American establishment: bankers, lawyers, former generals, the men who quietly ran the world from behind heavy oak doors. They expected a standard diplomatic briefing, a dry recitation of treaties and trade agreements. What they got instead was a declaration of war against the concept of safety. Dulles, in his flat, nasal, lawyerly drone, unveiled the strategy that would haunt the nightmares of a generation. He told the room that the old way of fighting, meeting the enemy soldier for soldier on the battlefield, was over. It was too expensive, and it was too passive. From now on, he declared, the United States would depend primarily upon a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing. The silence in the room was heavy. The diplomats decoded the legal language immediately. Means of our choosing meant nuclear weapons. Places of our choosing meant that if the Soviet Union drove a tank into West Berlin, the United States reserved the right to drop a hydrogen bomb on Moscow. If the Chinese army marched into Vietnam, the United States might not fight them in the jungle. They might vaporize Beijing. This was the doctrine of massive retaliation. It was a policy of zero tolerance enforced by the threat of total annihilation. Dulles was turning the American president into a man holding a loaded gun to the temple of the world, promising that he was crazy enough to pull the trigger if anyone moved a muscle. It was a terrifying gamble. It assumed that the Soviets and the Chinese were rational actors who would back down in the face of overwhelming firepower. But what if they didn't? What if they called the bluff? Dulles was betting the survival of the human species on the assumption that the other side blinked first. Later, in an interview with Life magazine, he gave this high-wire act a name that would stick to him like a curse. He called it brinkmanship. He explained it with the chilling confidence of a man who has never lost a negotiation. You have to take chances for peace, just as you must take chances in war. The ability to get to the verge without getting into the war is the necessary art. If you cannot master it, you inevitably get into war. If you try to run away from it, if you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. The necessary art. To Dulles, threatening the apocalypse was not madness. It was an art form. It was a psychological duel. He believed he possessed the stronger will, the harder spine, and the superior moral standing. He believed that God had given the United States the atomic bomb for a reason, to hold back the tide of godless communism, and that to be afraid to use it, or at least to threaten to use it, was a failure of faith. But while John Foster Dulles was shouting from the rooftops, threatening nuclear fire and brimstone, a quieter, darker, and infinitely more subtle war was being waged from the shadows. And this brings us to the most unique and formidable anomaly in the history of American power: the biological and political fusion of the State Department and the CIA. In February 1953, just weeks after John took over the State Department, his younger brother, Alan Welsh Dulles, was confirmed as the Director of Central Intelligence. It is difficult to overstate how strange and how dangerous this arrangement was. The man responsible for overt diplomacy and the man responsible for covert operations were brothers. They had grown up in the same house in Watertown. They shared the same DNA, the same grandfather, and the same worldview, but as men, they were a study in contrasts. John was the Puritan. He was stiff, socially awkward, faithful to his wife, and visibly uncomfortable with the pleasures of the flesh. He was the parson. Alan was the cavalier. He was charming, gregarious, a pipe-smoking extrovert who wore tweed jackets and possessed a wandering eye for women. Alan was the spy's spy, a man who treated espionage like a grand romantic game. While John was preaching sermons, Alan was seducing assets in cocktail bars in Bern and Berlin. Yet despite their differences, they operated with a telepathic synergy. This effectively erased the firewall between the State Department and the CIA. In any other administration, the Secretary of State and the CIA director were rivals, fighting for the president's ear, checking and balancing each other's power. In the Eisenhower administration, they were a two-headed monster. They didn't need official channels to communicate. They didn't need to write memos that could be subpoenaed by Congress. They talked on the telephone constantly, sometimes half a dozen times a day, their conversations a shorthand of murmurs and references that only they understood. They met for dinner on Sundays at the Mayflower Hotel or at John's house, sipping drinks and carving up the globe while the roast beef cooked. "I'll take care of the public condemnation," John would say effectively. "You take care of the rest." This partnership created a Janus face for American power. John would stand in the sunlight of the United Nations, condemning a foreign leader as a communist puppet, demanding adherence to international law. Meanwhile, in the dark, Allen would move the assets, the bribe money, the printing presses for fake propaganda, the assassins, and the saboteurs to undermine that very same leader. John provided the justification, Allen provided the execution. It was a terrifyingly efficient closed loop. When John needed a reason to intervene in a country, Allen's CIA would produce an intelligence estimate saying that country was drifting toward communism. John would then use that report to authorize Allen to launch a coup. They were judge, jury, and executioner, accountable only to the president. And Eisenhower, who preferred to remain above the dirty fray of politics, was often happy to let the dullest boys handle the messy business of empire. As 1953 turned into 1954, this machine was fully operational. The brothers turned their gaze toward the map, looking for weak points. They didn't see nations with their own histories and grievances. They saw battlegrounds in the Great Crusade. They saw Iran, where a nationalist prime minister was threatening British oil interests. They saw Guatemala, where a reformist president was threatening American fruit companies. They saw Vietnam, where the French Empire was dying. John Foster Dulles, the man of the law, and Allen Dulles, the man of the shadow, were about to unleash a wave of interventions that would topple democracies, install dictators, and ignite blowback that is still scorching the earth today. The poker game was over. The brothers were about to start flipping tables. The first test of the Dulles machine did not come from an enemy action, but from a stroke of biological fate. In March 1953, barely 6 weeks into the new administration, news broke from Moscow that shook the world. Joseph Stalin was dead. The man of steel, the dictator who had sent millions to the gulags and erected the Iron Curtain, had collapsed at his dacha. For a brief, shimmering moment, the world held its breath. A window had opened. In the Kremlin, a confused power struggle erupted. The new Soviet leadership, terrified and uncertain, sent signals that they might be willing to talk. They hinted at a thaw. In London, Winston Churchill, the old lion of diplomacy, smelled an opportunity. He urged President Eisenhower to organize a summit to reach out to the new Russian leaders while they were still finding their footing. "Let us talk to them," Churchill argued. "Let us see if we can pull the world back from the abyss." But John Foster Dulles slammed the window shut. To Dulles, the death of Stalin was not an opportunity for peace. It was a trap. In his Manichaean worldview, the Soviet Union was not a country run by men. It was a machine run by an ideology. It didn't matter if Stalin was dead. The godless terrorism of communism remained. He advised Eisenhower to ignore the olive branches. He argued that any gesture of friendship from the West would be interpreted as weakness. He wanted to increase the pressure, to force the confusing Soviet leadership to crack. "We must not relax," he told the president. "We must tighten the screws." Dulles won the argument. There would be no summit. There would be no early end to the Cold War. Instead, Dulles turned his eyes to the bleeding ulcer of Asia, Korea. The Korean War had been raging for 3 years. It was a stalemate, a frozen hellscape where American boys died to capture hills that were lost again the next day. Eisenhower had been elected on a promise to end it. But how do you end a war without losing it? Dulles believed he had the answer. He believed in the madman theory long before Richard Nixon made it famous. In May 1953, Dulles traveled to New Delhi to meet with Prime Minister Nehru of India. He knew that Nehru was the perfect conduit, a neutral leader who spoke frequently with the Chinese communists. In a quiet, polite conversation, Dulles dropped a bomb, metaphorically speaking. He told Nehru that if the armistice negotiations in Korea continued to fail, the United States would be forced to escalate. He intimated with terrifying cool that the U.S. would no longer respect the border of China and that it would no longer restrict the use of advanced weaponry. The message was relayed to Beijing: sign the peace deal or Washington will nuke you. It was the ultimate roll of the dice. Dulles was bluffing. Eisenhower was deeply skeptical about actually using atomic weapons in Asia, but the Chinese didn't know that. Terrified by the threat and exhausted by the war, the communists blinked. In July 1953, the armistice was signed. The guns fell silent along the 38th parallel. Dulles was ecstatic. To him, this was proof that brinkmanship worked. He had stared into the eyes of the dragon, brandished the nuclear sword, and the dragon had retreated. He believed he had found the magic formula for the Cold War, pure, unadulterated fear. But arrogance is a blinding light. Convinced of his own genius in Korea, Dulles immediately pivoted to the next crisis, confident he could solve it with the same tool. But this time, he was walking into a quagmire that would swallow him and America whole. The place was Indochina, Vietnam. By late 1953, the French colonial empire in Vietnam was collapsing. The nationalist forces of the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and the brilliant General Giap, were strangling the French army. Dulles was torn. Intellectually, he despised colonialism. He came from a country founded on rebellion against an empire. But emotionally, he hated communism more. He looked at the map of Southeast Asia and he didn't see a local war for independence. He saw the first domino. If Indochina fall, he warned, Thailand falls. Then Burma, then Malaya, then Japan. He began to pump American money into the French war effort. By 1954, the United States was paying for nearly 80% of the French war in Vietnam. We were buying the bullets, the planes, and the napalm. But it wasn't enough. In the spring of 1954, the French army made a fatal error. They baited the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle at a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu. They thought their superior firepower would crush the guerrillas. They were wrong. General Giap surrounded the valley with artillery hauled by hand up the mountains. The French were trapped. They were being slaughtered. Panic gripped Washington. The French begged for intervention. They wanted American airstrikes. And here, in the secret rooms of the Pentagon and the State Department, John Foster Dulles proposed something that chills the blood to this day. It was called Operation Vulture. Dulles, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Arthur Radford, drew up a plan to save the French. It involved a massive air raid by B-29 bombers, and included in the planning was the option to use 3 tactical nuclear weapons to wipe out the Viet Minh positions around the valley. Think about that. Less than a decade after Hiroshima, John Foster Dulles seriously considered dropping nuclear bombs on the jungles of Vietnam to save a dying French colony. Eisenhower, thank God, balked. He was a general. He knew that airstrikes wouldn't win a jungle war, and he knew that using nukes would make the United States a moral pariah. He set a condition. He would only intervene if the British agreed to join in a united action. Dulles flew to London to beg Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden. But the British had learned their lesson. They looked at Dulles with horror. "We will not," Eden said, "assist you in buying the wrong war at the wrong time." Without British support, Operation Vulture was grounded. Dien Bien Phu fell. The French surrendered, but Dulles was not done. If he couldn't win the war, he would rig the peace. The world powers gathered in Geneva in 1954 to decide the future of Vietnam. It was a tense, smoke-filled affair. The Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, was there. He was a sophisticated, brilliant diplomat. During a break in the sessions, Zhou Enlai saw Dulles across the room. He walked over, extending his hand in a gesture of goodwill. Dulles saw him coming. The cameras were flashing, the world was watching, and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State of the United States, turned his back on Zhou Enlai. He refused to shake the hand of a communist. It was a petty, calculated insult. It humiliated Zhou, who never forgot it. It signaled to the Chinese that there was no hope for respect from America. Dulles refused to sign the Geneva Accords, which partitioned Vietnam temporarily and called for national elections in 1956. He knew Ho Chi Minh would win those elections by a landslide. Dulles didn't care about democracy if democracy meant a communist victory. He walked away from Geneva and decided to create his own reality. He found a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic anti-communist who had been living in a seminary in New Jersey. Dulles essentially airlifted Diem into Saigon and said, "This is your country now." He drew a line at the 17th parallel and declared the existence of South Vietnam, a nation that had never historically existed. He poured money and advisors in to prop up Diem. He told the American people he was building a bastion of freedom. In reality, he was planting the seeds of a tragedy. He was committing the United States to the defense of a weak, unpopular regime, all because his rigid moral code could not accept a communist victory in a peasant nation halfway around the world. He thought he was saving Asia. In truth, he was digging the grave for 58,000 future American soldiers. While John was busy erecting these diplomatic fortresses in Asia, his brother Alan was growing restless in the shadows. The CIA director wanted action, not just containment. He wanted to prove that a surgical coup could be more effective than a standing army. And as the brothers scanned the globe, their eyes landed on the oil-rich sands of the Middle East. In the Persian Gulf of the early 1950s, two worlds existed side by side, separated by a fence and a century of resentment. On one side stood the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a state within a state where British administrators enjoyed air-conditioned villas and swimming pools. On the other side lay the shanty towns of the Iranian workers, built of tin and scrap wood, where men drank water contaminated with rats. For 50 years, London had treated Iran's oil as its personal piggy bank, pumping millions of barrels to fuel the empire while tossing pennies to the locals. It was a colonial parasite living on a host that was beginning to wake up. The Iranians, a proud people with a history stretching back to the Persian Empire, were sick of it. In 1951, their rage found a voice. They elected a new prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a nightmare for the West, not because he was a soldier, but because he was a character. He was an elderly, eccentric aristocrat who was prone to fits of public weeping during speeches. He often conducted official cabinet meetings from his iron bed, wearing pink pajamas, claiming he was too frail to sit up. Western diplomats mocked him as a hysterical old man. But behind the theatrics lay a razor-sharp nationalist mind. Mossadegh's platform was simple and electrifying. The oil is ours. In a move that sent shockwaves through the global economy, he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He kicked the British technicians out. He declared that Iranian resources would finally serve the Iranian people. The British were apoplectic. They saw this as theft. They blockaded Iran's ports, strangled its economy, and froze its assets. They wanted to invade, but it was 1953. Britain was bankrupt after World War II. They no longer had the muscle to reconquer a nation on their own. They needed the Americans. Under President Harry Truman, the British pleas had fallen on deaf ears. Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, had sympathized with Mossadegh. They saw him for what he was, a nationalist, not a communist. They saw the British for what they were, greedy colonialists trying to hold on to the past. Truman essentially told London to grow up and negotiate, but then came the election. Then came John Foster Dulles. The British intelligence services, MI6, knew exactly who they were dealing with. They knew that Dulles didn't care about the price of oil. He didn't care about corporate profits, or at least he pretended not to. He cared about the crusade. He cared about the devil. So the British changed their script. They stopped complaining to Washington about stolen assets and contracts. Instead, they whispered the magic words. They told Dulles that Mossadegh was weak. They told him that Mossadegh was unstable. And, most lethally, they told him that Mossadegh was the only thing standing between Iran and a takeover by the Tudeh party, the Iranian communists. If Mossadegh stays, the British whispered into Dulles's ear, Iran will fall. And if Iran falls, the Soviet Union gets the Persian Gulf. They get the warm water ports. They get the energy to run their tanks. Dulles took the bait hook, line, and sinker. In his Manichaean worldview, a neutral nationalist who tolerated communists in his parliament was indistinguishable from a communist agent. He couldn't grasp the nuance of Iranian politics. He didn't understand that Mossadegh hated the Soviets just as much as he hated the British. Dulles only saw the map. He saw a gap in the northern tier of defense. He sat in the Oval Office, his voice grave, and convinced President Eisenhower that Mossadegh had to go. It was a pivotal moment in American history. For the first time, the United States was preparing to overthrow a democratically elected leader of a sovereign nation during peacetime. There was no declaration of war. There was no congressional debate. There was just a phone call between John Foster Dulles at the State Department and Allen Dulles at the CIA. The plan was codenamed Operation Ajax. The man chosen to execute it was Kermit Kim Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Kim was the perfect instrument for the Dulles brothers, an Ivy League intellectual with a taste for adventure and a moral flexibility that allowed him to view bribery and subversion as necessary acts of patriotism. In July 1953, Kim Roosevelt crossed the border into Iran, slipping into Tehran not as a diplomat, but as a ghost. He didn't bring a Marine division. He didn't bring an Air Force. He brought a few thick suitcases. Inside them was $1 million in cash. The strategy was brutally simple, a testament to Dulles' cynical view of human nature. They weren't going to fight Mossadegh with ideas. They were going to fight him with chaos. They would use the money to buy the press, paying journalists to write screaming headlines, accusing Mossadegh of being a Jew, a communist, an atheist, and a British spy, all at the same time. Contradiction didn't matter, only volume mattered. Then they would buy the mob. As the summer heat intensified in Tehran, turning the city into a pressure cooker, John Foster Dulles sat in his air-conditioned office in Washington, waiting for the telegrams. He went about his public business, signing treaties and giving sermons, maintaining the facade of the respectable statesman. But his mind was thousands of miles away, visualizing the streets of Tehran filling with smoke. He was playing God with the destiny of 20 million people, convinced that his spiritual mandate gave him the right to decide who should rule them. He believed he was saving Iran from itself. He had no idea that he was lighting a fuse that would burn for 25 years before blowing up in America's face. The stage was set. The money was distributed. The thugs were hired. The gray man had placed his bet. Now the chaos began. In the sweltering heat of August 1953, the streets of Tehran became the stage for a grotesque piece of political theater, choreographed entirely by American money. Kim Roosevelt, operating from the shadows of the U.S. Embassy compound, began to pull the strings. He didn't just hire generic thugs. He hired a cast of characters that seemed ripped from a dark carnival. He recruited a local wrestling champion and street enforcer known as Shaban the Brainless. Shaban was a giant of a man, famous in the Zorkhaneh, with a terrifying reputation for violence and a loyalty that could be bought for a handful of toeman. Alongside him, Roosevelt recruited the proprietors of Tehran's brothels. He paid them to send their women into the streets, chanting pro-Mossadegh slogans while performing lewd acts, effectively associating the Prime Minister's nationalist cause with sexual immorality in the eyes of the pious public. Then the script flipped. Roosevelt paid other mobs, often the same people just wearing different shirts, to attack mosques and tear down statues of the Shah, shouting that Mossadegh was doing this. The goal was to create a sense of total anarchy, to make the average Iranian believe that Mossadegh was leading the country into a godless communist abyss. But history is rarely a straight line. The first attempt at the coup, launched on the night of August 15th, was a disaster. Mossadegh, alerted by loyal officers, was waiting. The Imperial Guard sent to arrest him were themselves arrested. The plot was blown wide open. Panic swept through the conspirators. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man the Americans were betting everything on, lost his nerve completely. He fled the country, piloting his own small plane first to Baghdad and then to Rome. We have a vivid picture of the Shah in those days. A young, terrified man sitting in the lobby of the Hotel Excelsior in Rome, shaking with fear, convinced he had lost his throne forever. He was ready to abdicate. He was ready to live out his days as a playboy exile in Europe. Back in Washington, the mood was grim. The cable traffic between the State Department and the CIA was frantic. John Foster Dulles, the man who detested failure, was reportedly furious. The coup had been exposed. The United States had been caught red-handed trying to topple a sovereign government. The logical, prudent move was to cut ties, deny everything, and retreat. But the Dulles brothers did not operate on logic. They operated on faith and hubris. Allen Dulles, communicating with Kim Roosevelt, gave a different kind of order. Double down. They didn't retreat. They simply poured more money into the fire. On August 19th, the second wave hit. This time, the chaos was absolute. Roosevelt mobilized the military units. he had bribed. General Fazlollah Zahedi, a man the British had once arrested during World War II for pro-Nazi sympathies, came out of hiding to lead the charge. Tanks rolled through the streets of Tehran. The hired mobs, led by Shaban the Brainless, stormed the government buildings. The fighting was fierce. 300 people died in the streets, Iranian killing Iranian paid for with American dollars. The tanks surrounded Mossadegh's home. The elderly prime minister, listening to the explosions from his bed, finally realized the game was over. He surrendered. When the news reached Washington, John Foster Dulles was jubilant. The gamble had paid off. The gray man had stared down the forces of nationalism and won. The Shah was flown back from Rome, bewildered by his sudden reversal of fortune. He was reinstalled on the peacock throne, but he was a changed man. He knew now that he sat there only by the grace of the United States. He was no longer just a king, he was a client. Dulles immediately moved to cement the victory. The oil began to flow again, this time with American companies getting a 40% share of the consortium. The British got their 40% back. Mossadegh was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, a ghost in his own country. For Dulles, this was the ultimate validation of his worldview. He had saved a strategic asset from the clutches of communism. He had proven that covert action was a cheap, effective alternative to war. Why send 100,000 troops when you can send one Kim Roosevelt with a suitcase? But in his victory lap, Dulles was blind to the tragic irony of what he had done. By crushing Iran's fledgling democracy, he destroyed the moderate center of Iranian politics. He taught a generation of Iranians that the democratic process was a sham and that the United States was a hypocritical empire that preached freedom but practiced tyranny. The Shah, empowered by Dulles, built a brutal police state. He established SAVAK, a secret police force trained by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad, which became infamous for torture. For 25 years, the Shah kept the lid on the boiling pot of Iranian resentment. But when the lid finally blew off in 1979, the explosion didn't produce a democracy. It produced the Islamic Revolution. The chants of death to America that echoed in 1979 were the delayed echo of the tank fire in 1953. John Foster Dulles died thinking he had saved the Middle East. In reality, he had radicalized it. But in late 1953, flushed with the success of Operation Ajax, Dulles didn't see the future shadows. He only saw the present success. The method worked. The brothers looked at the map again. They looked for another problem spot, another leader who dared to defy the American order. They looked south. They looked at the banana plantations of Guatemala. And this time, the conflict of interest wouldn't just be political, it would be personal. The target wasn't just a threat to America, he was a threat to the Dulles family bank account. In the 1950s, the nations of Central America were not truly sovereign states. They were company towns, and the company was the United Fruit Company. Known throughout Latin America as El Pulpo, the octopus, its tentacles were everywhere. It owned the railroads, the telegraph lines, the only major port in Guatemala, and vast swathes of the country's fertile land. It operated with the impunity of a colonial viceroy, exempt from taxes and immune to local laws. In 1951, Guatemala dared to dream of a different future. They elected Jacobo Arbenz, a serious, bespectacled former military officer with a Swiss father and a fierce sense of national dignity. Arbenz was not a communist, he was a capitalist who simply wanted Guatemala to become a modern, independent nation. He looked at his country and saw a feudal absurdity. 2% of the population owned 70% of the land. Meanwhile, United Fruit owned hundreds of thousands of acres of uncultivated jungle, land they kept empty purely to prevent competitors from rising up, while peasant farmers starved for lack of soil to till. Arbenz passed Decree 900, a land reform law. It was moderate by any standard. The government would expropriate the unused land of large plantations and distribute it to the poor. Crucially, the government would pay for it. Arbenz offered United Fruit full compensation based on the value of the land declared on their own tax returns, and that was the trap. For decades, United Fruit had been lying to the Guatemalan taxmen, undervaluing their land to pay pennies in taxes. Now, Arbenz was holding them to their own lie. The company was outraged. They cried theft. They claimed the land was worth millions more than they had declared, but they couldn't admit to tax fraud. So instead, they screamed communism. They went to Washington to demand an intervention. And in Washington, they didn't just find a sympathetic ear, they found their old payroll. This is the dark heart of the Dulles legacy, the moment where the line between American foreign policy and corporate profiteering dissolved completely. Before becoming Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles had been a senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. His biggest client? The United Fruit Company. He had personally negotiated the contracts that gave the company its tax-exempt status in Guatemala. His brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, had sat on the company's board of directors. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs was a major shareholder. The Dulles family fortune was, in no small part, built on bananas. When United Fruit called, the Dulles brothers answered. John Foster Dulles didn't recuse himself for a conflict of interest. He weaponized the State Department to protect his former client. He framed the land reform not as a dispute over bananas, but as a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. He labeled Arbenz a crypto-communist. In a chilling assessment, he declared, "If they give a duck the right to vote, it's still a duck." In his eyes, Arbenz was a duck and the season was open. In 1954, the brothers launched Operation PB Success. If Iran was a coup of brute force, Guatemala was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The CIA knew the Guatemalan army was loyal to Arbenz, so they couldn't just bribe a general like they did in Tehran. They had to break the country's mind. They set up a clandestine radio station, the Voice of Liberation, broadcasting from the jungles of neighboring Honduras. The radio announcers, trained by the CIA, broadcast fake news reports of a massive rebel invasion. They reported battles that never happened, defections that never occurred, and uprising that didn't exist. They jammed the Guatemalan government's signals, leaving the population isolated in a bubble of panic. Simultaneously, the CIA hired American pilots to fly unmarked P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes over Guatemala City. They didn't bomb targets so much as they bombed the psychology of the people. They dropped blocks of dynamite to create loud explosions and empty soda bottles that whistled like falling bombs. They terrified the population. On the ground, the CIA assembled a liberation army, a ragtag group of 480 mercenaries, led by a disgruntled furniture salesman turned colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas. Militarily, this force was pathetic. The Guatemalan army could have crushed them in an afternoon. But the army officers, listening to the fake radio broadcasts and watching the American planes circle overhead, believed they were facing a massive U.S. Marine invasion. They panicked. They turned on Arbenz. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz, a man who had tried to follow the law, was forced to resign. In a final act of humiliation orchestrated by the CIA, he was searched at the airport, stripped down to his underwear in front of the cameras before being allowed to flee into exile. He would die years later, a broken alcoholic drowning in his bathtub in Mexico. John Foster Dulles went on national television in the United States to declare victory. With the solemnity of a bishop, he told the American people, "The people of Guatemala have cleansed themselves of the malignancy of international communism." The reality was a bloodbath. Castillo Armas, the new U.S.-backed dictator, immediately suspended the Constitution. He rolled back the land reform, returning every acre to United Fruit. He burned books. He disenfranchised the illiterate. He established death squads to hunt down labor leaders and intellectuals. Guatemala plunged into a 40-year civil war that would eventually claim the lives of 200,000 people, a genocide of the Mayan peasantry that remains a stain on the conscience of the world. But there was one final unforeseen consequence of the Dulles brothers' success. Living in Guatemala City during the coup was a young, wandering Argentine doctor. He was 26 years old, idealistic, and drifting. He watched the American planes bomb the city. He watched the democratic government fall. He watched the hypocrisy of John Foster Dulles, a man who preached Christianity while protecting a fruit company. He tried to organize a resistance, but it was hopeless. He fled to the Argentine embassy, and there, amidst the ruins of Guatemalan democracy, he came to a radical conclusion. You cannot negotiate with the United States. You cannot reform a system that the Americans control. You can only fight them with a gun in your hand. That young doctor's name was Ernesto Che Guevara. The coup that John Foster Dulles orchestrated to stop communism in 1954 actually radicalized the man who would become the global icon of communist revolution. Che traveled to Mexico, where he met Fidel Castro. He told Castro about what he had seen in Guatemala. He told him that if they ever took power in Cuba, they must destroy the army and secure the revolution immediately, or the Americans would do to them what they did to Arbans. By trying to stamp out a spark in Guatemala, John Foster Dulles inadvertently poured gasoline on the fire that would consume Cuba 5 years later. As 1954 ended, Dulles was at the zenith of his power. He was Time magazine's Man of the Year. He had redrawn the map of the Middle East and Latin America. He felt vindicated. He felt invincible. But inside his own body, a cellular rebellion was beginning. The cancer that would eventually kill him was taking root, just as the seeds of anti-American hatred were taking root in the nations he had saved. The apostle of the apocalypse was winning the battles, but he was losing the war for the human soul. By 1955, John Foster Dulles had toppled governments in Iran and Guatemala, signed treaties encircling the globe, and established himself as the undisputed vicar of American foreign policy. But if his successes in the covert world gave him confidence, his obsession with the Red Menace in Asia was about to push the world to the very edge of the nuclear precipice. For Dulles, the Cold War in Europe was a frozen conflict, a standoff of static lines. But Asia was fluid. Asia was dangerous. And the epicenter of his anxiety was the tiny island of Taiwan. Dulles held a special, almost religious animosity toward the People's Republic of China. He refused to even acknowledge the name. To him, Mao Zedong and the communists were bandits who had stolen the mainland. He recognized only the defeated nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, exiled on Taiwan, as the real China. This wasn't just policy, it was personal. Dulles had purged the State Department of anyone who suggested that Mao was there to stay. He had constructed a fantasy world where Taiwan was a mighty fortress that would one day reconquer the mainland. In late 1954 and early 1955, that fantasy collided with reality. The Chinese communists began shelling 2 tiny clusters of islands, Quemoy and Matsu. These islands were absurdly small, rocks really, sitting just a few miles off the coast of mainland China. They were militarily useless. Every general in the Pentagon, including President Eisenhower, knew they were indefensible. To fight for them would be like the Chinese trying to fight for Staten Island. But to John Foster Dulles, geography didn't matter. Symbolism mattered. He believed that if the United States allowed the communists to take these two rocks, it would be a show of weakness that would cause the entire structure of anti-communist alliances in Asia to collapse. He invoked the domino theory again. First Quemoy, then Taiwan, then Japan. So Dulles did what he did best. He walked to the brink. He authored the Formosa Resolution, which Congress passed in January 1955. It gave President Eisenhower a blank check to use American military force to defend Taiwan, and Dulles made sure the world knew exactly what force meant. In private meetings and public hints, he suggested that the United States was prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons against the Chinese mainland to save Quemoy and Matsu. Think about the madness of this moment. The Secretary of State was willing to risk World War III and the death of millions over a few square miles of rock inhabited by fishermen simply to prove a point about resolve. Dulles flew to Taipei. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Chiang Kai-shek. He stared across the strait at the Red Army. It was the ultimate game of chicken. And once again, terrified by the prospect of American nuclear fire, Mao Zedong backed down. The shelling stopped. Dulles claimed another victory. "We walked to the brink," he told his admirers, "and we looked it in the face." But he was exhausting his allies. The British, the Canadians, and the French looked at Dulles with growing horror. They saw a man who treated nuclear weapons like a policeman's baton. They began to wonder, is this man trying to save the world, or is he trying to end it? But the crisis in Asia was just a prelude. The real storm was gathering in the Middle East, centered around a man who Dulles hated almost as much as he hated Mao, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Nasser was the charismatic new leader of the Arab world. He was young, secular, and fiercely independent. He didn't want to be a puppet of the British, nor a puppet of the Soviets. He wanted Egypt to be a leader of the non-aligned movement. Dulles despised the very concept of non-alignment. In his theology, neutrality is obsolete. You were with God, or you were with the devil. He looked at Nasser's refusal to pick a side and saw duplicity. However, Dulles initially tried to buy Nasser's loyalty. The United States offered to fund the Aswan High Dam, a massive engineering project on the Nile that was the centerpiece of Nasser's dream for a modern Egypt. It was a transaction, American money for Egyptian stability. But Nasser was playing a dangerous game. While taking American money, he recognized Red China diplomatically. He bought weapons from Czechoslovakia. He was trying to play the superpowers against each other to get the best deal for Egypt. Dulles was furious. He felt personally insulted. He felt that Nasser was mocking American generosity. He decided to teach the Egyptian leader a lesson in humility. He wanted to humiliate Nasser publicly, to show the world what happens when you bite the hand of John Foster Dulles. On July 19, 1956, the Egyptian ambassador arrived at the State Department. He was expecting to sign the paperwork for the Aswan Dam loan. Instead, Dulles kept him waiting. When he finally admitted him, Dulles didn't offer a seat. He simply read a brief, cold statement withdrawing the offer of funding. He effectively told the ambassador, "We don't trust your economy, we don't trust your leader, and you get nothing." It was a slap in the face delivered with the arrogance of a colonial magistrate. Dulles thought Nasser would crawl back, chastised and begging. He was wrong. Dulles had miscalculated the pride of the Arab street. 7 days later, on July 26, 1956, Nasser stood before a massive crowd in Alexandria. In a fiery speech, he recounted the American insult. Then, he dropped the bombshell. He shouted the code word de Lesseps. Troops stormed the offices of the Suez Canal Company. Nasser announced to the roaring crowd, "We are nationalizing the Suez Canal. The profits of the canal will build the dam." Dulles was stunned. He had tried to punish Nasser by taking away his money. Instead, he had provoked Nasser into seizing the most strategic waterway in the world. The lifeline of the British Empire, the oil artery of Europe, was now in the hands of the man Dulles had tried to break. Dulles had lit a match to check the fuel level in the tank. Now the explosion was coming, and this time it wouldn't be the enemies of America who started the war. It would be America's oldest friends. The summer of 1956 turned into a nervous autumn. John Foster Dulles watched from Washington as the consequences of his arrogance rippled across the Mediterranean. He had tried to break Gamal Abdel Nasser by cutting off his money. Instead, Nasser had seized the Suez Canal. For the British and the French, this was not just a diplomatic crisis. It was an existential threat. The canal was the windpipe of their economies. Without it, they couldn't get oil. Without oil, their industries would freeze. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, was desperate. He viewed Nasser as a Mussolini on the Nile, a dictator who had to be stopped before he consumed the Middle East. But Dulles was playing a different game. He was obsessed with the upcoming U.S. presidential election in November. President Eisenhower was running for a second term on a platform of peace and prosperity. The last thing Dulles wanted was a messy colonial war in the Middle East that would alienate Arab voters or drag the U.S. military into a conflict. So he stalled. He proposed conferences. He proposed a Suez Canal Users Association, a bureaucratic nothing burger designed to bore the parties into submission. The British and French looked at Dulles and realized the truth. He isn't going to help us. In fact, he is going to stop us. So they went rogue. In late October 1956, in a secret villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, the leaders of Britain, France, and Israel met in the dark. They hatched a plot so cynical it belonged in the 19th century. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, racing toward the canal. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides to stop fighting and protect the canal. When Nasser inevitably refused, the European powers would invade, seize the waterway, and topple the Egyptian government. They didn't tell Eisenhower. They didn't tell the CIA. And crucially, they didn't tell John Foster Dulles. They knew that if the gray man found out, he would shut it down. On October 29, 1956, the trap was sprung. Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Sinai. 2 days later, British and French bombers began pounding Egyptian airfields. In Washington, John Foster Dulles was furious. His fury wasn't just diplomatic, it was personal. He felt betrayed. The men he considered his junior partners, his allies, had gone behind his back. He was the vicar of the free world. They were the congregation. And the congregation had dared to sin without his permission. But the timing made the sin unforgivable. At the exact moment British bombs were falling on Egypt, Soviet tanks were rolling into Budapest. The Hungarian people had risen up against communist rule. It was the moment Dulles had dreamed of for years: liberation. He wanted to point a finger at the Soviets and scream "butchers" at the United Nations. But he couldn't, because his own allies, the champions of freedom, were acting like butchers in Egypt. Britain and France had destroyed the moral high ground of the West. They had made Dulles look like a hypocrite. Dulles, despite being in agonizing pain from what he thought was a stomach ulcer, went to the Oval Office. He told Eisenhower that they had to choose. They could support their old colonial friends, or they could support the rule of law. Dulles chose the law. In a move that shocked the world, the United States joined the Soviet Union in the United Nations to condemn the invasion. Imagine the scene. The United States and the USSR, the archenemies of the Cold War, voting together to humiliate Great Britain and France. Dulles took the podium at the UN. He looked tired, his face gray and drawn. He declared, "We cannot have one law for those who oppose us and another for those who are our friends." It was a noble sentiment. It was perhaps the most moral moment of his career, but the punishment he inflicted was brutal. The British pound began to collapse under the pressure of the war. Anthony Eden called Washington, begging for a loan to prop up the currency. Dulles didn't just say no. He effectively held a pillow over the face of the British economy. He blocked the International Monetary Fund from helping. He told the British ambassador, "We will not give you a dime until you get your troops out of Egypt." It was financial strangulation. The British had no choice. Humiliated, broken, they announced a ceasefire. They withdrew. Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace, his health and career destroyed. John Foster Dulles had won. He had stopped the war. He had upheld the principle that might does not make right. But the victory came at a terrible strategic cost. By humiliating Britain and France, Dulles shattered the Western alliance. He proved that the European powers were no longer superpowers. They were merely client states of America. And by saving Nasser, he inadvertently turned the Egyptian leader into a hero of the Arab world. Nasser didn't thank the U.S. He turned toward the Soviet Union, who were happy to step into the vacuum Dulles had created. The gray man had stopped a colonial war, but he had opened the door for the Soviets to enter the Middle East, a door that has never fully closed since. But as the dust settled on Suez, the architect of this chaos finally collapsed. On November 3rd, 1956, in the middle of the crisis, Dulles was rushed to Walter Reed Hospital. The pain in his gut, which he had dismissed as an ulcer, revealed a far darker truth: adenocarcinoma, colon cancer. The surgeons removed a foot of his intestine, and though they told the public he was fine, the clock had started ticking. The man who had played poker with the apocalypse was now playing a losing hand against his own mortality. But while his body was broken, his mind was racing. Even as the anesthesia wore off, he was calling for his briefing papers. He was demanding a telephone. The Suez Crisis had shattered the old world order. Britain and France, the policemen of the Middle East for a century, had been humiliated and broken. They were retreating, and Dulles, staring at the ceiling of his hospital room, realized something terrifying. He had created a vacuum. In geopolitics, nature abhors a vacuum. If the British were leaving the Middle East, who would fill the void? Dulles knew the answer. The Soviet Union was waiting. Nikita Khrushchev was already courting the Arabs, sending arms to Egypt and Syria, promising aid without the colonial strings attached. Dulles could not allow that. He dragged himself out of his sickbed with a terrifying, almost masochistic determination. He believed he was the only man who could stop the red tide. He ignored his doctors. He ignored his wife. He went back to work. His answer to the post-Suez chaos was the Eisenhower Doctrine. Announced in January 1957, it was a piece of legislation that effectively declared the United States the new emperor of the Middle East. It authorized the president to use military force to assist any nation in the region requesting assistance against armed aggression from any country controlled by international communism. Read between the lines, it was a blank check for intervention. It stripped away the pretense of diplomacy. Dulles was telling the world that the Middle East was now an American protectorate. He wasn't interested in Arab nationalism or the rights of Palestinians or the complexities of Islam. He was only interested in one thing: keeping the Russians out. But here lies the tragedy of Dulles' intellect. He was brilliant at grand strategy, but he was illiterate in human emotion. He didn't understand that the people of the Middle East didn't want to be protected by America any more than they wanted to be ruled by Britain. They wanted dignity. They wanted sovereignty. By forcing the Arab nations to choose sides, to sign up for the Eisenhower doctrine or be labeled an enemy, Dulles alienated the very people he was trying to save. He pushed Syria closer to the Soviets. He turned Nasser into a martyr hero who railed against American imperialism. The Pactomania continued. Dulles was obsessed with drawing lines on the map. He had NATO in Europe. He had CETO in Asia. Now he cobbled together the Baghdad Pact in the Middle East. He viewed these alliances as a ring of steel around the Soviet Union. But to the people living inside that ring, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like a cage. The non-aligned nations, India, Egypt, Indonesia, looked at Dulles with deep suspicion. They heard his speeches where he declared that neutrality is an immoral and short-sighted conception. They realized that in Dulles' eyes, they were not sovereign nations. They were merely pawns on a chessboard, expected to sacrifice themselves for the king. As 1957 turned into 1958, the strain began to show on the man himself. Dulles was living on borrowed time. The cancer was gone, theoretically, but his digestion was ruined. He lived in constant discomfort. He stopped eating at diplomatic dinners, picking at a piece of cottage cheese while others feasted. His face became skeletal. His eyes, always cold, now looked haunted. Yet his power over President Eisenhower was absolute. Eisenhower, the man of action, had come to rely entirely on Dulles, the man of words. They were a symbiosis. Eisenhower trusted Dulles to handle the dirty work, to be the lightning rod for criticism, allowing the president to remain the smiling, grandfatherly figure above the fray. Critics in the Senate began to mutter. They called Dulles the arrogant moralist. Senator J. William Fulbright publicly questioned whether Dulles' rigid stance was actually causing the very conflicts he claimed to be solving. But Dulles brushed them off. He believed he answered to a higher authority than the Foreign Relations Committee. In the summer of 1958, the Middle East exploded again, a direct result of the vacuum Dulles had tried to fill. A violent coup in Iraq toppled the pro-Western monarchy. The king was murdered, his body dragged through the streets. Pan-Arabism was sweeping the region like a wildfire. Panic gripped the small Christian-led government of Lebanon. They called Washington. They invoked the Eisenhower doctrine. Help us, or we fall to the radicals. Dulles didn't hesitate. He told Eisenhower, "We have to go in." On July 15, 1958, U.S. Marines waded ashore on the beaches of Beirut. It was the first time American combat troops had been deployed to the Middle East. Tourists in bikinis watched in confusion as tanks rolled up the sand. It was a surreal, almost absurd image. The might of the American empire landing to stop a civil war in a country the size of Connecticut. Dulles claimed it was necessary to stop communism. In reality, there were hardly any communists in Lebanon. It was a local sectarian conflict. But Dulles had turned every local squabble into a global crisis. The Marines stayed for 3 months. They stabilized the government, but the message was sent. The United States was now the policeman of the Arab world. The gray man had redrawn the map yet again, but his own map was running out of territory. By late 1958, the pain in his abdomen returned. It was a dull, gnawing ache that aspirin couldn't touch. He tried to hide it. He used a heating pad during staff meetings. He grimaced through the agony on flights to Taiwan and Paris. He was dying. And as the cancer cells multiplied, spreading to his neck and his spine, the world was becoming more dangerous, not less. The Soviets were launching Sputnik. The missile gap was terrifying the American public. Fidel Castro was marching toward Havana. The apostle of the apocalypse was about to face his final judgment. He had built a fortress of treaties, nukes, and spies to keep the darkness out. But he couldn't stop the darkness growing within. The winter of 1958 was bitter, both in Washington and in the soul of John Foster Dulles. He was 70 years old. The sheer physical toll of his tenure was beginning to show on his face, which had taken on the texture of old parchment. He had flown nearly 500,000 miles in 6 years, a staggering distance in the era of propeller planes. He had lived out of suitcases, slept in embassy guest rooms, and survived on a diet of rich, diplomatic dinners and airplane whiskey. But the world had no pity for an old man's fatigue. In November 1958, Nikita Khrushchev, the mercurial leader of the Soviet Union, decided to test the American spine one more time. He issued the Berlin Ultimatum. Khrushchev declared that the current situation in Berlin, a divided city deep inside East Germany, with Western troops occupying the western half, was intolerable. He gave the Western powers 6 months to get out, 6 months to turn West Berlin into a demilitarized free city. If they refused, he threatened to hand control of the access routes over to the East Germans, effectively blockading the city. It was a gun to the head of the West. If the U.S. refused to leave, the Soviets might block the roads. If the U.S. tried to force the roads open, it meant war, nuclear war. Dulles received the news in his office at Foggy Bottom. His gut was gnawing at him, a constant dull ache that he dismissed as diverticulitis. But his mind was crystal clear. He knew this was a bluff. He knew Khrushchev was trying to exploit the perception that Eisenhower was a lame duck president nearing the end of his term. Dulles went to the White House. He told Eisenhower, "We cannot give an inch. If we abandon Berlin, we abandon Europe." He crafted a response that was classic Dulles, legalistic, rigid, and utterly unyielding. He declared that the Soviet Union had no legal authority to tear up the post-war treaties. "We are in Berlin by right of conquest," he argued, "and we will stay by right of force if necessary." He flew to Europe in December 1958 to rally the Allies. He was in agony. He could barely sit through the meetings. He sat on a cushion to relieve the pressure on his spine, but he managed to stiffen the resolve of NATO. The deadline passed. The Soviets blinked. The crisis was postponed, but while Dulles was staring down the Russians in Berlin, he was missing the fire starting in his own backyard. This is the great failure of the Dulles intelligence machine. For years, the CIA, run by his brother Alan, had been obsessed with Europe and Asia. They viewed Latin America as a sleepy backwater, a safe zone of American hegemony. They had grown complacent. On the island of Cuba, a bearded lawyer named Fidel Castro had been waging a guerrilla war against the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista for 2 years. The State Department was divided. Some diplomats warned that Castro was a radical. Others, lulled by Castro's promises of democracy, thought he was just another nationalist reformer. Dulles, distracted by Berlin and distracted by pain, took his eye off the ball. He trusted the established order. He trusted that Batista, brutal as he was, would hold on. On New Year's Eve, 1958, the impossible happened. Batista fled. The Cuban army collapsed. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's bearded revolutionaries rolled into Havana on tanks. The crowds cheered. The American mafia bosses fled the casinos. Dulles was stunned. A communist revolution, or what looked rapidly like one, had succeeded just 90 miles from Florida. The rollback policy had failed. The containment policy had failed. The fortress of the Western Hemisphere had been breached not by a Soviet army, but by a ragtag group of students and farmers. The psychological blow was immense. Dulles had spent 6 years building a wall around the Soviet Union, only to find the enemy setting up camp on his front porch. He tried to pivot. He tried to organize diplomatic pressure against Castro. But it was too late. The momentum of history was shifting, and his body finally decided it had had enough. In early February 1959, Dulles prepared for yet another trip to Europe. The Allies were nervous about Berlin again. They needed the gray man to come and hold their hands. Dulles told his wife, Janet, that he had to go. "It is my duty," he said. He packed his tuxedo. He packed his Bible. And he packed a supply of heating pads and painkillers that would have stunned a horse. He was walking into his final battle, and he was doing it on his knees. February 1959. The trip to Europe was intended to be a victory lap, a show of solidarity against the Soviet threat in Berlin. Instead, it became a funeral procession for a living man. John Foster Dulles arrived in London, Paris, and Bonn looking like a ghost. His suit, once perfectly tailored, hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His collar size had shrunk. He walked with a noticeable stoop, clutching his stomach whenever he thought the cameras weren't looking. The pain was no longer a dull ache. It was a screaming, tearing agony in his abdomen. He was unable to eat solid food, surviving on small sips of broth and raw determination. Yet the performance he gave was nothing short of superhuman. In Bonn, he met with Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the stoic leader of West Germany. Adenauer and Dulles were soulmates of the Cold War, both devout Christians, both fierce anti-communists, both believers in the Iron Curtain. Adenauer was terrified that the United States, under a new Secretary of State, might abandon Berlin to the Soviets. Dulles, speaking through the fog of painkillers, looked his old friend in the eye. He gripped Adenauer's arm. "Conrad," he said, "I will not let them pass." It was a promise made by a dying man to a threatened nation. It calmed the panic in West Germany. It was his final act of brinkmanship, not against the Soviets, but against his own biology. He flew to Paris to meet Charles de Gaulle. The arrogant French general usually looked down on American diplomats, but even de Gaulle was moved by Dulles's condition. He saw a man literally working himself to death for his cause. De Gaulle later wrote that he saw in Dulles a great patriot and a soldier of peace. When Dulles boarded the plane back to Washington on February 9th, he collapsed. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the summits evaporated. He lay in his bunk on the plane, groaning in agony. He knew. He had to know. The hernia he had been blaming was a lie he told himself to keep going. On February 10th, 1959, the motorcade didn't go to the State Department. It went straight to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The official story released to the press was that the secretary was undergoing surgery for a hernia repair. But when the surgeons opened him up on February 13th, the operating room fell silent. It was a catastrophe. The cancer they had removed in 1956 had returned with a vengeance. It wasn't just in his colon. Seeds of malignancy were scattered throughout his abdominal cavity. It was in his lymph nodes. It was growing on his spine. There was nothing to cut out. The surgeon simply sewed him back up. The diagnosis was terminal. Time remaining, weeks, maybe months. President Eisenhower was informed immediately. The old general, who had sent thousands of men to their deaths on the battlefield without flinching, broke down. He rushed to the hospital. He sat by Dulles's bedside holding his hand. For 6 years, Dulles had been his shield, his lightning rod, his brain trust. Eisenhower had once said, Foster knows more about foreign affairs than any man alive. Now he was watching the library burn down. For a few weeks, Dulles tried to fight the inevitable. He set up a command center in the presidential suite at Walter Reed. He had secure phone lines installed. He had his deputies bring stacks of cables to his bed. He tried to run the Cold War while being pumped full of radiation and morphine. It was a macabre spectacle. Foreign ambassadors would come to visit, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed, while the Secretary of State, pale and shrunken, lectured them on the importance of NATO unity. He refused to let go. He believed that he was the indispensable man. He believed that without his hand on the tiller, the ship would crash into the rocks of communism. But by April, the radiation was destroying his body faster than the cancer. He could barely speak. He couldn't walk. Finally, on April 15, 1959, he accepted the truth. He asked for a telephone. He called the White House. "Mr. President," he rasped, "I have to resign." Eisenhower didn't want to accept it. He argued. He offered to give him a leave of absence. He offered to keep the seat open. But Dulles whispered, I can't do it, Ike. I just can't do it anymore." The resignation was announced the next day. A shockwave went through Washington. It was the end of an era. For 6 years, John Foster Dulles was American foreign policy. He had been the face of the West. He was hated by half the world and revered by the other half, but he was respected by everyone. Even the Soviets sent a telegram, stiff, formal, but acknowledging the passing of a worthy adversary. Eisenhower appointed Christian Herter as the new Secretary of State, but everyone knew it was a placeholder. The giant had fallen. Dulles lingered for another month. He spent his final days in a haze of sedation. He had visitors. Billy Graham came to pray with him. Winston Churchill came to pay his respects. The old rivalry forgotten in the face of death. But the most poignant moment came when his brother Alan visited. The two brothers, the spy and the statesman, sat together in the quiet room. They had reshaped the world. They had overthrown governments in Iran and Guatemala. They had built a global intelligence network. They had protected the United Fruit Company and the Shah. They had done it all in the name of freedom and in the name of the Dulles family legacy. Now, one was dying, and the other was left alone to manage the shadows. Alan held John's hand. There were no more secrets to swap, no more coups to plot. Just the silence of two men who had played a game with high stakes and were finally cashing out. On May 24th, 1959, John Foster Dulles died in his sleep. He was 71 years old. The state funeral at the Washington National Cathedral was massive, attended by kings, prime ministers, and generals. They buried him in Arlington National Cemetery, the resting place of warriors. But a grave cannot bury consequences. Even as the dirt fell on his coffin, the machine he had built was still running. For the first time in 6 years, that machine had no operator. In the shadows of Langley, Virginia, his brother Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, was driven by a desperate need to honor John's legacy. He believed the best way to mourn his brother was to finish the work they had started, and that unfinished work was Cuba. Throughout late 1959 and 1960, Allen dusted off the playbook from Guatemala. He thought if they could topple Arbins with mercenaries, they could do the same to Fidel Castro. This hubris led directly to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a disastrous slaughter that destroyed the Dulles mystique in a single afternoon and forced Allen into disgraced retirement. The dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a whimper on a Cuban beach. Yet the ghost of John Foster Dulles was not done haunting the world. The road to the quagmire of Vietnam was paved by his refusal to sign the Geneva Accords in 1954. The 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall are in many ways the delayed casualties of his rigid domino theory. The death to America chants in Iran in 1979 were the echoes of his 1953 coup, and the radicalization of Che Guevara was the direct blowback of his protection of United Fruit in Guatemala. In the final tally, John Foster Dulles played poker with history and left the table while he was ahead, leaving the debt to be paid by the generations that followed. He infected American policy with the dangerous idea that the world is only black and white, and that to save the world, we have the right to break it. A man dies, but his decisions do not. They live on, buried like landmines in the soil of history, waiting for the footsteps of future generations to set them off.